The email was brief, almost cryptic. Expedition opportunity. Remote ruins in the Andean jungle. High pay. Non-disclosure required. Contact for details. At first, I thought it was a scam, but the sender's name, Dr. Elias Moore, changed everything. Moore was a legend in the field of archaeology, a man whose discoveries filled textbooks and museum halls. If he was reaching out, it had to be important. I accepted without hesitation. A week later, I found myself on a rickety plane descending into the dense jungle. The flight had been long, and my mind buzzed with excitement. Ruins like these were rare, untouched by modern exploration. Dr. Moore had been vague about the site's origins, mentioning only that it belonged to a civilization predating the Inca by thousands of years. The base camp was little more than a cluster of tents and equipment near the edge of a clearing. Dr. Moore greeted me personally, his weathered face and sharp eyes giving away years of experience. "You've made a wise decision coming here," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This could change everything we know about ancient civilizations." The next morning, he handed me a folder marked Rules. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in bold, clinical font. "Do not enter the ruins after sunset. Never touch the inscriptions with your bare hands. If you hear whispers, do not respond. Always work in pairs when exploring the second level. Leave immediately if the temperature drops." I raised an eyebrow, but Dr. Moore's expression remained serious. "We've lost people here," he said bluntly. "These rules aren't suggestions, they're survival tools." "Lost people?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he handed me a key to the supply tent. "Be ready to start at dawn, and remember, follow the rules." The next day, the jungle was alive with sound as we trekked to the ruins. Birds called from the canopy, and the air was thick with the hum of insects. But as we approached the site, the sounds faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The ruins emerged from the foliage like jagged teeth, massive stone structures covered in moss and vines. They exuded an age that felt almost oppressive. The main temple loomed ahead, its entrance flanked by massive pillars inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize. The carvings were intricate, yet alien, their meaning elusive even to someone with years of fieldwork. I resisted the urge to touch them, the rules flashing in my mind like a warning. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. The walls were lined with more inscriptions, and the floor was littered with fragments of pottery and bone. The deeper we went, the colder it became, despite the heat outside. It wasn't enough to follow Rule 5, but I noted the drop. We spent the day cataloging artifacts and mapping the temple's layout. By the time we emerged, the sun was dipping below the horizon. "Time to head back," Dr. Moore said, his voice firm. As we left, I glanced back at the ruins. In the fading light, they seemed almost alive, the shadows shifting as though something within was watching us. The ruins were mesmerizing in the daylight, but they were far more unsettling in the stillness of dawn. I arrived early, the jungle around me shrouded in a light mist. The rest of the team was still setting up, their movements slow and deliberate as they hauled equipment toward the temple. I adjusted my pack and stepped into the cool shadow of the entrance. The carvings along the walls seemed to ripple in the dim light, as if they were alive. I shook the thought away, focusing on the task at hand. Today, my job was straightforward. Document the inscriptions along the main corridor and map out the branching paths deeper inside. Armed with gloves, a flashlight, and a sketch pad, I ventured further into the ruins. The main chamber was massive, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. Shafts of sunlight filtered through cracks in the stone, illuminating fragments of pottery scattered across the floor. The inscriptions covered every available surface, winding along the walls and even across the broken steps of a staircase leading downward. Do not touch the inscriptions with your bare hands. Rule 2 echoed in my mind. I was careful to follow it, tracing the carvings with gloved fingers as I copied their shapes into my sketch pad. They were intricate, unlike anything I had seen before. Swirls and lines merged into what looked like figures, their angular forms both human and inhuman. As I worked, a faint sound broke the silence. It was subtle at first, like the distant hum of wind, but it grew steadily louder. I froze, holding my breath. The sound wasn't wind, it was whispers. If you hear whispers, do not respond. The rule came back to me in an instant, and I clamped my mouth shut. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I swept the beam across the chamber. It revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just ancient stone and scattered debris. The whispers grew softer, fading into the background like they had never existed. I exhaled slowly and tried to focus, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thicker, and the faint scent of decay lingered longer than before. I moved cautiously to the staircase, shining my flashlight into the darkness below. The second level wasn't part of my assignment for the day, but my curiosity gnawed at me. The carvings grew denser as they descended, the patterns becoming almost chaotic. I remembered Rule 4. Always work in pairs when exploring the second level. I hesitated. Logic told me to stay on the first level, to stick to the plan, but the pull of the unknown was stronger. With a steadying breath, I descended the first few steps, just enough to get a closer look at the carvings. The temperature plummeted. It was sudden, like stepping into a freezer, and my breath fogged in the beam of the flashlight. Rule 5 blared in my mind. Leave immediately if the temperature drops. I backed away quickly, climbing the steps 2 at a time until I was back in the main chamber. The warmth returned just as suddenly, and I gasped for air, my heart racing. Dr. Moore's voice echoed from the entrance. All clear. I turned, relief washing over me at the sight of his silhouette. Yeah, I lied. All clear. He nodded, but his sharp eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. Good. Keep it that way. As I packed up for the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The rules weren't just for safety, they were warnings, and I was starting to understand why. The next morning, the jungle was quieter than usual. Even the ever-present buzz of insects seemed subdued, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I arrived at the ruins with a heavy sense of unease. The carvings from the day before haunted me. Their alien patterns burned into my mind. I tried to rationalize it as overwork or a lack of sleep, but a gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Dr. Moore handed out assignments for the day, and I was paired with one of the newer team members, a young and eager researcher named Carter. He had a boundless enthusiasm that made him seem oblivious to the tension in the air. Let's see what we can find today, he said with a grin, hefting his gear. Our task was to explore and catalogue more of the main chamber, avoiding the second level per Rule 4. I was grateful for the company. Carter's chatter filled the oppressive silence that had settled over the ruins. Together, we worked methodically, documenting artifacts and sketching more of the inscriptions. The whispers from the previous day were absent, but the air still felt thick, charged with an invisible energy. We were halfway through cataloguing a row of carvings when Carter, lost in his enthusiasm, pulled off his gloves to get a better feel for the inscriptions. I turned just in time to see his bare hand brush against the smooth, ancient surface. Carter, stop! I shouted, but it was too late. The reaction was immediate. The air around us grew colder, and the inscriptions began to glow faintly, their shapes pulsating like veins filled with molten light. Carter stumbled back, his face pale. What the hell? He started, but his words were drowned out by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the chamber. The light spread, crawling along the walls and floor, illuminating symbols I hadn't noticed before. They converged toward the staircase leading to the second level, as though the ruins themselves were guiding something upward. "Rule 2, I whispered, my voice trembling. "Never touch the inscriptions." Carter's eyes were wide with fear. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "It was an accident." The hum intensified, and then we heard it, a low guttural sound that seemed to emanate from deep within the ruins. It was a noise that didn't belong to any creature I knew, primal and menacing. My flashlight flickered as the temperature dropped sharply, my breath forming clouds in the air. "Leave," I said, grabbing Carter's arm. "We have to get out." We ran, the sound following us, growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to close in, the glowing symbols casting long, jagged shadows that danced like living things. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We burst out of the ruins into the blinding sunlight, gasping for air. The jungle was eerily silent, the oppressive stillness pressing down on us like a weight. Dr. Moore was waiting at the entrance, his expression grim. "You touched them," he said, his voice a mix of anger and fear. It wasn't a question. "It was an accident," Carter said, still trembling. Dr. Moore didn't respond. Instead, he turned to me. "Did you hear anything?" I nodded. "Something's down there." His face darkened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "You've woken it." The gravity of his words settled over me like a shroud. The rules weren't just about caution, they were about containment. And now, because of us, that containment was failing. Dr. Moore didn't waste time. As soon as we returned to the camp, he called an emergency meeting. The team gathered around a makeshift table in tense silence, their faces pale under the flickering light of lanterns. Carter sat with his head in his hands, guilt etched into his features. "This is not the first time this has happened," Dr. Moore began, his voice low and steady. "And it won't be the last, unless we act now." He unrolled a map of the ruins, its surface marked with annotations and symbols. At the center was the main chamber, and beneath it, a network of tunnels and chambers that descended deep into the earth. "These ruins were built as a barrier," he continued, his finger tracing the second level. "A prison meant to contain something ancient and dangerous." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The hum I had felt in the ruins seemed to echo in my chest as he spoke. "What is it?" I asked, breaking the silence. "What's down there?" Dr. Moore hesitated, his gaze flicking to Carter. "We don't know its true nature. The locals speak of a being that consumes the will of those who break its laws. They say it's not alive in the way we understand life. It's more like a force, one that grows stronger with disobedience." Carter looked up, his voice shaking. "I only touched it. That can't be enough to—" "You don't understand," Dr. Moore cut him off. "The rules are absolute. Even the smallest infraction disrupts the balance, and now it's waking." He turned back to the map, pointing to the staircase leading to the second level. "It's contained by layers of inscriptions and wards, but those are powered by the rules. When they're broken, the containment weakens. If we don't restore balance, it will escape." The room fell silent. The enormity of the situation settled over us like a storm cloud. "What do we do now?" I asked. Dr. Moore exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "We need to repair the containment, but the deeper levels of the ruins are too dangerous to explore without following the rules to the letter. We must reinforce the boundaries and restore the inscriptions." The plan was set. A small team, including me and Dr. Moore, would descend to the second level to assess the damage and make repairs. Carter would stay behind, too shaken to continue, As we prepared our gear, the air grew colder, and the jungle around us seemed to darken, as though the ruins were draining the life from the world above. We entered the ruins at dusk, the fading light casting long shadows across the stone. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls like a heartbeat. As we descended the staircase, the temperature dropped sharply, and my flashlight flickered. The second level was unlike anything I had seen. The walls were covered in glowing inscriptions, their light pulsating erratically. The air was thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The chamber ahead was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center stood an altar, its surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift under my gaze. Dr. Moore approached the altar cautiously, his gloved hands trembling. "This is where the containment is focused," he said. "The altar anchors the wards, but it's damaged." As he examined the carvings, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low guttural growl that made my blood run cold. It came from the shadows beyond the altar, where the light of our flashlights couldn't reach. "We're not alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Dr. Moore straightened, his face pale. "Whatever happens, do not break the rules. Stay together, stay silent, and don't touch anything you don't have to." The growl grew louder, and the shadows seemed to move, coalescing into a shape that defied logic. It was massive and fluid, shifting constantly as it emerged from the darkness. Its presence was suffocating, its form both alien and familiar, as though it was everything and nothing at once. I clutched my flashlight, my heart pounding as the entity moved closer. The glow of the inscriptions faltered, their light dimming as the creature approached. "We have to act now," Dr. Moore shouted, his voice breaking through the terror. He began tracing the carvings on the altar, muttering under his breath as he worked to restore the inscriptions. I stood frozen, torn between the urge to run and the knowledge that there was nowhere to go. The entity stopped, its form towering over us. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze, heavy and probing, as though it was assessing my every thought and fear. The hum grew deafening, and the air became so cold it burned my lungs. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a voice that resonated inside my mind, twisting my thoughts into chaos. It offered me freedom, power, knowledge beyond comprehension, all in exchange for one simple thing: to break the rules again. I clenched my fists, forcing the voice out of my head. "No," I whispered, though my entire body screamed to give in. The creature shifted, its form pulsating angrily. Dr. Moore's voice cut through the chaos. "It's a trick. Don't listen to it." With a final movement, he completed the inscription, and the carvings on the altar blazed with light. The entity let out a roar, its form dissolving into smoke as the glow spread through the chamber. The hum faded, replaced by a profound, almost holy silence. The containment was restored. For now, we stood in the silence of the second level, our breaths mingling with the cold, heavy air. The glowing inscriptions on the walls pulsed faintly, like the embers of a dying fire. Dr. Moore leaned against the altar, his face pale and drenched in sweat. The strain of restoring the containment had clearly taken its toll. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The damage is too great. The containment will fail again unless we reinforce it permanently." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. The entity's presence still lingered, like a stain on the air, and I could feel its hatred pressing against the walls of its prison. "How do we make it permanent?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Moore hesitated, his gaze flicking to the glowing altar. "There's a ritual," he said finally. "An ancient one. It requires a sacrifice, someone to bind themselves to the ruins and the entity forever." My stomach churned. You're saying someone has to stay here? Alone? For how long? His eyes met mine, and the answer was clear. Forever. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the chamber, at the shifting inscriptions and the jagged shadows cast by our flashlights. The weight of the choice was crushing, and my mind raced with possibilities. If no one stayed, the entity would escape. The rules were the only thing keeping it contained, and someone had to enforce them. "I'll do it," Dr. Moore said, his voice steady but tinged with resignation. "This is my responsibility. I brought you here, I gave you the rules, and I failed to stop this from happening." "No," I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could think them through. "You've spent your life studying these ruins. You're the only one who understands them. If you stay, what happens when something else goes wrong?" He shook his head. "It's not your burden to bear." But it was. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. I was the one who had ignored the rules, who had let Carter touch the inscriptions and unleashed the entity. The responsibility was mine, and deep down, I knew there was no escaping it. "I broke the rules," I said firmly. "I let this happen. If someone has to stay, it should be me." Dr. Moore stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "The ritual is simple," he said. "You place your hand on the altar and speak the binding words. The ruins will do the rest." I stepped forward, my heart pounding. The glowing inscriptions on the altar seemed to shift as I approached, their light growing brighter. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the cold, smooth surface. The words came to me as though they had been etched into my mind, ancient and guttural. I spoke them aloud, my voice echoing through the chamber. The light from the inscriptions flared, blinding and all-consuming, and the air around me vibrated with an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. For a moment, I felt the entity's rage, its hatred burning through my veins like fire. But then it faded, and the light began to dim. The ruins fell silent, the hum replaced by an eerie stillness. I turned to Dr. Moore, but he was already backing away, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "It's done," he said. "You've restored the balance." I nodded, but my chest felt hollow. The weight of my decision pressed down on me, and I realized the full extent of what I had agreed to. I would stay here, alone, to maintain the rules and keep the entity contained. It was the only way. As Dr. Moore climbed the stairs, his flashlight fading into the distance, I turned back to the altar. The inscriptions glowed faintly, their light steady and unyielding. I was part of the ruins now, and the rules were my life. The first few days alone in the ruins were quiet. The air was heavy with the same oppressive silence that had been present since I arrived. But it felt different now, charged, alive. I spent my time patrolling the chambers, inspecting the inscriptions, and reciting the rules to myself like a prayer. They were my anchor, my purpose, and my only protection. The glow of the carvings remained steady, a faint reminder of the entity's presence. I could feel it in the background, its rage simmering just beneath the surface, but it was contained. The ritual had worked, and the boundaries held, for now. At night, the whispers returned. They crept through the ruins like a slow tide, faint and fragmented, their words just beyond comprehension. I forced myself to ignore them, to follow Rule 3. If you hear whispers, do not respond. But their persistence gnawed at me, wearing down my resolve with each passing hour. The isolation was suffocating. I found myself thinking about the outside world, about the team, about Dr. Moore, about the life I had left behind. I wondered if they had returned safely, if they would ever come back. The thought of seeing another human face felt like a distant dream. One evening, as I sat near the altar, I heard something new. Footsteps. They echoed faintly through the chamber, deliberate and unhurried. My heart raced as the rules flashed in my mind. If you hear footsteps in the hallway, remain silent. I stayed perfectly still, clutching my flashlight as the sound grew closer. The steps stopped just beyond the doorway, and a shadow moved across the wall. I held my breath, willing myself to remain calm. After a few tense moments, the shadow retreated, and the footsteps faded into the distance. The air grew colder, and I knew the entity was testing me, probing for weakness. The days blurred into weeks, and the rules became second nature. The ruins were my prison, but they were also my responsibility. I learned to navigate the chambers in the dark, to sense the shifts in the air that signaled the entity's movements. I understood now that the rules weren't just for survival. They were part of the containment, a delicate balance that had to be maintained at all costs. Then, one day, I heard voices. They were faint at first, drifting down the staircase from the surface, but they grew louder as they approached. My chest tightened as I realized what it meant. Someone had come back. I climbed to the main chamber, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. 2 figures stood near the entrance, their voices echoing in the stillness. They were young, researchers by the look of them, their packs filled with equipment. One of them spotted me and froze, his face pale. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm the keeper," I replied, the words strange and foreign in my mouth. "You need to leave." The other researcher stepped forward, confused. "We were sent to study the ruins. Dr. Moore said they were safe." I shook my head, the weight of the rules pressing down on me. "They're not. Follow the rules, and you might survive. But if you break them..." I let the sentence hang, the silence speaking louder than words. The researchers exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't argue. I handed them a copy of the rules, the same list I had once dismissed as superstition. As they read, their faces darkened, and I saw the same fear I had felt on my first day. They left soon after, their footsteps fading into the jungle. I returned to the altar, my hands tracing the carvings as I whispered the rules to myself. The ruins were quiet again, but I knew it wouldn't last. The cycle had started anew, and one day, someone would break the rules. They always did. I was part of the ruins now, and the rules were absolute. The entity would wait, patient and unyielding, testing the boundaries until the balance faltered once more, and I would be here, watching, waiting, ensuring the rules were never forgotten.